Okay, folks, I think we might as well kick off, mightn't we? So I would like to welcome everybody here. This is the third in our series of workshops exploring the phenomenon of urban depth at different scales, with a particular focus on how it relates to individual autonomy. It's really nice to see everybody. Just one sort of technical plea from me to begin with. If you possibly can, it's lovely if you can keep your cameras on for reasons actually connected with what I just said as people were coming in. That is that it's nice for presenters to feel like they're not just talking into the void. Don't worry, you can do other things if you need to potter around. You're not glued to the camera. And obviously if it's not appropriate for you to have the camera on, that's fine. But it's just nice to try and reproduce some of the face-to-face contact that's characteristic of how we would have run these things if we'd been in person. So keep your camera on, but please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking, because it reduces the danger of interference from elsewhere. Just a quick note, which is that we are recording and we're recording this session. And the recordings plus other materials will be on the project website when we finish it. Can I just check, has the recording started, Hannah? Good, okay, so we're underway with that. Good, so as I said, this is the third in our series of workshops, and this week we're looking at city depth. So we're looking at the phenomenon of urban depth, not at the scale of individual pieces of architecture as we did the first time, or at the scale of neighborhoods as we did 2 weeks ago, but now looking at it on the full city scale. We've got 4 presenters who are going to be thinking about this topic from various areas of practice and academic fields. We're going to start off today's session with those speakers speaking each for 10 minutes, and then afterwards at the very end there'll be some time for questions and discussion to fill up the 2 hours. Today's presenters are Birgit Hausleitner, Fiona Scott, Nicola Bacon and Francesca Freud. I'll introduce them a little more for each of their individual talks. Thanks very much to our presenters for coming along and sharing your ideas. I think we're all really excited to see what you have to say to us. Couple more housekeeping things before we actually kick off. I should introduce, for those who haven't been here before, the project team. So Jane Klossick is the PI on this project. Jane, I don't know whether you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Hello, everyone. My name's Jane and I'm the lecturer in urban design at London Met, and my research has focused around urban depth since it was the topic of my PhD. And in fact, 2 of my PhD supervisors are here today, I'm delighted to say, including Fiona, who is presenting for us. And it's been really delightful to develop this collaboration with Ben and to start to engage in deeper political, philosophical understandings of how architecture and the built environment relate to society.
Thank you, Jane. So yes, I'm Ben Coburn. I'm Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Glasgow. My main research is in some quite foundational questions around the nature and the value of individual autonomy and how it relates to the social networks we find ourselves in and to other related sort of liberal and philosophical ideals. But I also have a sideline in thinking about how you can put these kinds of foundational philosophical concepts to work in practice, where that's supposed to be a dialogue where one talks to people engaged in practice and you refine your concepts in light of that, as well as offering these concepts as tools for solving real world problems. So it's in that spirit that I've been collaborating with Jane on this project for a few years now. It's been exciting to talk these things through. The third member of our team is Hannah, who I suspect most of you will have heard more of than from either Jane or me. Hannah, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. I'm Hannah. I graduated with my master's in architecture about 2 years ago, or coming up to 2 years, from London Met. And since then I've been working in a couple of practices, and since about August last year working at London Met on various projects, including this one.
Wonderful, thank you. So the purpose of these workshops is manifold, but here are a few of the things that we're hoping for. What we want is to understand the significance of urban depth at different scales from the perspective of different disciplines and from the perspective of practice in urban design and architecture. We're trying to identify a common language for thinking around these things, and we want to build up a collaborative network around this topic. The idea is that we want to make some funding bids for larger projects in the future, and we're really excited to see if there are other people who are interested in coming along with us on that journey. As that suggests, this is quite an early stage in our investigation, so we don't have a very firm idea of which output specifically we want here. We want things to emerge organically, and we look forward to everybody shaping the discussion and participating in what we produce. So in that spirit, here are a couple of final practicalities. We'd love to find out who everybody is here. You know who we are and what we're hoping for. Hannah has already posted in the chat for this Zoom meeting the link to our Miro board. Miro is the online collaborative tool that we're using to record our thoughts, our questions, and to share resources during these meetings. You'll see that there's a space for you to note your name, so please do that. It's a good way of getting used to how to use the tool as well if you're unfamiliar with Miro. And generally speaking, this is where we're going to record our ideas about each of these topics and about today's presentations. So please do, as we go on today, contribute to the shared resource, and don't worry about messing it up or doing something inappropriate. As I said, we want this to be a work in progress, and we expect it to be a little bit messy in light of the messiness of the topic. If you have trouble with the Miro board, then you can send a private message to Hannah, or you can put any contributions you want to make in the chat to this Zoom meeting, and then we'll be able to post it on the Miro board instead. On that Miro board, you'll also find links to information about future workshops in this series, the final one, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, and you'll be able to find the briefing document for this workshop, which gives a little bit more information about what we hope for from this particular session. Hannah, I wonder if you could put a link to that briefing document into the chat for the Zoom as well when you get a moment. Thank you. Good. Okay, so let's move on to our presentations. As I said, each of our distinguished speakers today has 10 minutes. Speakers, I'll give you a brief warning at 8 minutes, just so that you know that you're coming to the end of your time. We'll go through all of our speakers, and then we'll shift to discussion. I'll tell you a bit more about how I'll run the discussion session when we get to it. But in the meantime, if you have questions for speakers that occur to you as we're going along, you can put them in two places. You can put them into the chat box in this Zoom meeting. I'll keep an eye on them, and then I'll call you to ask those questions in the session later when we're discussing. Or if you prefer, you can put questions up on the Miro board, and I'll harvest things from there. But please remember to put your name on the notes there if you want me to call you by name rather than reading it out myself. Okay, well, that's all of the practicalities dealt with, I think. So in that case, it gives me very great pleasure to invite our first speaker, who in fact has been on board with this project longer than most other people, I think, which is Birgit Hausleitner. Birgit is an architect and urbanist and a lecturer at TU Delft, and is going to be our first presenter. So please take it away, Birgit.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me, Ben. I just share my presentation. What I am presenting to you today is a glimpse related to my wider research. I work since many years in the field of mixed use and the relation between urban structure and economic program, looking at different types of economic program, small scale businesses, but also lately more at manufacturing. What's the relevance of urban structure on it, and an aspect of it was what's the relevance of urban depth for it. I start with street view image nevertheless, because in the end it's the street where everything comes together and manifests. But I want to make two main points today. One is the relevance of depth on the between the scales, and adaptivity of urban depth and what contributes to it. The first case I want to show you, my main case study city at the moment is Amsterdam. We're zooming in the pre-16th century city of Amsterdam. That is what I highlighted here in the dotted line. Most of you will probably be familiar with Amsterdam with this famous image of the canal rings. So what we're talking about is not even the canal rings, but it's actually the very dense part of the pre-16th century city that has this very iconic image that we know from Amsterdam with these very tiny little houses that usually are somewhere between 5 and 10 meters wide, mostly very narrow. And the question is, how does this one transform and what role does urban depth play for that? What we could observe in the last 20-25 years already was a trend, or let's say it started around 50 years ago, that these buildings weren't large enough anymore. So I start with the architectural scale, and gradually an upscaling of functions took place that actually required an upscaling of buildings. But because, of course, we know the whole Amsterdam inner city is protected, it was necessary to connect buildings and enable larger structures within this network of small buildings. So what you see here is actually a zoom into the very old part of Amsterdam. And all the orange lines you see here in the dark buildings are walls that are broken through. So all the buildings that are dark gray are actually connected buildings. And the effect of that was not only that along the main streets we had a loss of entrances, so a substantial reduction of entrances, but also we had sometimes an upscaling that the building itself got lost and the block actually became the smallest unit. And with this, of course, you can imagine also urban depth on the block scale got lost. Why that happened, I just show you here two examples in the Amsterdam inner city, a very, very common one, that a hotel is built and that easily takes 6 to 8, sometimes even the whole block of buildings, or restaurants, so that we have only these connections on the ground floor. That is valid also for shops. So in some point, an upscaling of the unit of use takes place, and that usually causes a reduction of urban depth. I now assume that you have been also attending the last lectures, so that you know a bit what means urban depth when we, for example, start with Jane's lecture last time, even within the economic unit. But that's the smallest thing that is happening. What the next aspect of this is, Amsterdam's inner city in the 1970s became also a rather dangerous part in places, because especially in all these tiny back alleys, quite a lot of prostitution and drug misuse took place. So the effect this had is that the municipality said, okay, let's close all these back alleys. That way it becomes more safe for the local residents. That has had as effect that what you see here in the photos, in a lot of places they made gates. And on the map you see all the red lines, which are actually closed alleys. And the green, at a certain moment, then about 5-6 years ago, the municipality recognized, hey, with what we've been doing, we had an upscaling of the block system. The permeability was really very much decreasing on the neighborhood scale. So the urban depth in the blocks was increasing, but on the city scale, it became inaccessible. For example, you can walk very easy from north to south, but you couldn't walk anymore from east to west. So they are testing now, or have been testing in the last 5 years. Can we open temporarily these back alleys? How that looks like when we are zooming in a little bit further again, that's a zoom into one of these blocks. So what we can see, the original pre-16th century structure was like this. So that one here was one block. This one was one urban block. And that one was one block. What you can see already, these are very densely built. There is no outdoor space. So basically there is no urban depth on this previous original scale given. So with this transformation, the city actually did, with closing all these back alleys, some sort of urban depth was established, which actually suddenly allowed the appearance in this very dense city that usually we know it from having all these shopping streets at the edges of these newly created blocks. Inside, suddenly we have actually place for residents, for complementary activities like children can play there, people take out their coffee and their book. So this establishment of that new border, this new zone, actually brought quite an very important quality to the inner city, enhancing the living quality of the residents there substantially. Important is that, so you see here, what you see here in red are all these tiny gates that can open and close everywhere. The important point I want to make, the relevance we have, or the message we have to give, or we gave in this case to the municipality, you have to think in these terms. How can we open and close gates? How can we increase and shrink the border, public and private, or increase, make more zones between the really public and the really private? That is a very valuable principle we can learn from this very old city, and we can see how we can translate that in new developments, but also keeping this quality in the old part. An important thing why this actually still works is because all these tiny public pathways, they were never sold, they were never privatized. So the city has, even now decades later, the option say, okay, let's reopen some of them because the city needs it at the moment, which then again enables even economic activity to take place inside these blocks. And my next case, I again want to start with the smaller scale, is the relevance of urban front sides and urban edges. Now I start with the urban block because this is something we are very familiar with as architects. We talk about the outside of the block and the inside, and that is something that works very complementary. In economic functions terms, a very obvious thing to state, but I think it makes the point later on. We know that, of course, functions that have a higher capital can exist more along the main streets. That's an example from Paris now, Rue de Belleville, where all the tiny dotted, red dotted areas are actually shops. And inside the block, because that's a quite large block, we have manufacturing, we have artists, we have shared gardens, everything that cannot exist at the exterior. Now, what does that mean when we actually zoom out and try to reinterpret that system on the city scale? So what I did here is actually try to interpret in my research what makes an urban front side on the city scale and what makes sort of a backside, which I then say it's not a backside anymore, but it's an edge, and that's a complementary situation. So whatever you see here in red are urban blocks, which have a very high central location. Now I'm talking in space syntax terms, which I'm sure Francesca later will also probably refer to. That means streets which have a very high likeliness that they are used to walk through, but they also have a very high density, which indicates a very high density of people. So the build density is high, a very fine granularity. And the opposite is actually all the black lines we find here. Now, what I did in Amsterdam is actually identify what makes an inner urban border, or an edge at least. And that usually happens when the natural flow of pedestrian movement is interrupted. And that can happen through a canal that doesn't allow to be crossed very often, or what we see here in the north, which is actually, I'm sorry, I didn't put that in, my map doesn't, or it's in, but hardly visible. It's the sea actually, the IJsselmeer. Then we have the big river here. So there are landscape elements which can fragment the city in a way that it builds an inner urban edge. Why this is important? A lot of cities currently tend to say, okay, let's eliminate these urban edges because they make a rupture in the city. But what I found in my research,
you have about 2 minutes left, okay?
Yeah, nearly done. So what we saw before, the centralities, the highly central lines, of course, you know, these are the locations where we find shopping streets, high streets, but the inner city fringe, the urban edge, has a very high importance to accommodate other functions like manufacturing, for example, maybe larger scale housing estates, everything that isn't really fitting in very central locations. And that means, for example, what we see here, the streets don't go on. Now we are here located at this place. And the point I want to make, where it then links to urban depth on the city scale. Now we have locations where we have centralities, so like this line, a long linear element which builds an edge. We have long linear lines which build centralities, like here, for example. But then when we look at the modern city, we don't have this closeness, this proximity of. So we have here a centrality and here an edge. The same here, an edge and a centrality. In a modern city, this doesn't exist anymore. So the modern city lacks the edge situation in a way. And the effect that has then is, for example, looking at economic activities again. When we're very close by central lines, there are some functions that can afford the direct location, but others can't. So the top part is retail, the bottom part is manufacturing, where then the architecture has actually to buffer and establish the depth which the city doesn't have, or the location doesn't have. And the last slide I want to show is now when we're now a bit further away from the most central locations, we know retail still needs to take the edge with a direct connection from the public space into the building. But now also, since we're a bit further away, also functions with less capital can actually sustain a street front location. But then usually they have, like manufacturing, they need more outdoor space. So they will have probably a front garden. Point I want to make is we have to see that in the cities, we don't only think in how can we make central main streets, but we have also allowed the edges in longer lines, complementary to the long lines which build the main streets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Birgit. That was wonderful. I would now like to ask our second speaker to get ready. This is Fiona Scott. Fiona is a director of Gort Scott, the architectural practice, and also one of the Mayor of London's design advocates. Fiona, perhaps you'd like to share your screen and take it away.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben. Can everybody hear me, or can you hear me? Is that before I start wittering away? Okay. Yes, so thanks very much for inviting me. I'd like to talk very much from an in-practice perspective. I run an architecture practice, design practice, and most of our work is based in London. So we also do design-based research and apply that to our design projects, which we do primarily with developers and public authorities. And I guess for the whole of the life of our practice, it feels as if we've sort of seen and participated in an ongoing contest between housing and everything else that makes up the city, and that sort of everything else can be quite fragile. And while I think we've seen attitudes shift quite a bit, in practice that housing still really dominates. And you know, we do design housing at Gort Scott, but it's really how it relates to the other stuff that we're most interested in. So in that context, I wanted to show you some research about high streets in London. So these are places where some of the most intense mixed uses happen. And I'm sure that you will have heard a lot about high streets in others of these workshops. So I started with a piece of self-initiated research that was sponsored by Design for London as part of the London Development Agency, and this was more or less a decade ago now. And the study focused on an outer London bit of one of these kind of indelibly ancient arterial Roman roads along the A18 that runs into Aldgate. And zooming in, I sort of looked at these urban blocks on the high streets, these kind of very low key, quite unloved, really quite scruffy, polluted, but doing a lot with a little, and very varied and mixed. So it was an observational study. So through drawing and understanding the urban form, how these places evolved over time, how they adapt to different uses, even within quite tiny plots, a kind of progressive process of extension and intensification, how they accommodate lots of different forms, uses, scales, types of development along their length, and often with quite random or seemingly random adjacencies. Here you have like a DIY shop, a church, an office, a restaurant, and sort of bakeries in there. So I think we started also to see how unprotected by policy a lot of these mixes of uses was, and therefore how vulnerable they were, and how vulnerable they continue to be to types of development that don't do anything to support the importance of the sort of strategic role of the high street in the urban fabric. So this was a sort of qualitative and observational analysis, but it did start to become quite quantitative too, looking at existing buildings, a number of different businesses and a number of people working in them. And that piece of work was significant to me because it led to what was a substantial piece of research at the time for Design for London. So there's High Street London, which we did with Matthew Colmona at UCL and Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis. And so this was a study that was able to support and influence policy, and it ended up forming the basis for the Outer London Fund and Mayor's Regeneration Fund, High Street Fund. So pots of money to invest in these really complex places that had been seen as kind of too difficult to deal with. And I guess at a high level, it was important to start to see London's 600 high streets spatially as a network. And this plan became a sort of much reproduced mapping. And once those shapes were defined, it was possible to kind of plot them against other data. So for example, here, looking at how they relate to town centre boundaries and sort of seeing how unprotected a lot of them were by policy. So zooming in, the blue shaded bits identify the mixed use blocks, and you can see that much of London's mixed use is kind of crammed into these very thin crusts of activity along these 600 streets. And then you zoom in again, this kind of expansion of the earlier hand-drawn studies showing urban form mix in the blocks, and seeing the high streets explicitly not as just the street frontage, but as having this urban depth, three-dimensionality, varied internal and external spaces. And that the study really gave weight to the fact that we still have to kind of constantly remind people, even 10 years later, that high street doesn't equal retail, and it never has. In Tottenham, 50% of the land use within a couple of minutes walk of the high street was industrial. Only about a third of it was retail or commercial. I think the work formed, well, yeah, so some more numbers. About a quarter of London is within 2.5 minutes walk of high street. Half of businesses outside the central activity zone are in high street blocks, which also accommodate about 1.5 million jobs. So yeah, the work, it formed an evidence base for why the public sector should invest in high streets, and specifically that if London was going to grow, it should happen in a sort of mutually beneficial way around these streets, and not in ex-industrial or greenfield places on the edge of London where there was none of that existing kind of complex mesh of social and economic networks that had evolved over generations. So the next GLA study that came off the back of that High Street London work a few years later, we actually weren't involved in, and this was done by We Made That, some of you may know, but this is where high streets and their sort of surrounding ecosystem were identified and described in terms of how they support and create social value. And I think that work was really critical in bringing that kind of language and those priorities into the mainstream. And I think, so to sort of follow that trajectory a few years later after that, we teamed up with We Made That, and I led a piece of research called High Streets and Town Centres Adaptive Strategies as part of the Mayor's Good Growth by Design series at the GLA. And that kind of moves on from analysis to focus on the types of projects and interventions that can support what we know that high streets do well, while also seeing them as part of a process of evolution and change. And so how you physically do that whilst strengthening and not undermining the infrastructure and the networks that we know to be inherently quite fragile, but also with an emphasis on social and economic inclusion in the ongoing process of urban change. So this was really a piece of guidance about how to plan and deliver in a sort of iterative and responsive way, involving all of the public and private and third sector parties involved in high streets towards a common goal or a mission. And we worked with the top economist Mariana Mazzucato, and if you know her, you might recognise some of the language around mission-oriented change. But so these were our principles, which were the concluding part of the guidance. And one of the ways that we got there was by looking at what really good projects and initiatives were already happening on London's high streets. And so we sort of took some of those existing proposals and pushed or enhanced their kind of ambition to sort of further achieve certain goals. And so there were 10 of these case study propositions which formed the main body of the research, and each of them focused on some kind of fairly cross-cutting themes like experience and convenience economies, well-being, civic life, the culture of work, how we use data. And I know that I don't have hardly any time, so just picking one. On Old Kent Road, we looked at how to build on what already exists to plan for a successful mix of activities and uses on the high street. And so that, the proposition there was to make a ground floor strategy.
Just 2 minutes, Fiona, thank you.
Okay, thanks, I'll race. To make a ground floor strategy, and then to kind of set out a process to achieve that. So starting with research, stakeholder engagement, market review, and coming to a way of devising a ground floor strategy, which looked at urban design, looked at the design of units and the disposition of units, and also how they were controlled and managed, like leases and, you know, what you might call curation. I mean, it sort of seems obvious, perhaps, but certainly from my experience, still on the projects that we work on, very much ground floor uses are defined by estate agents. So we've actually found this work really important in helping to sort of back us up and support the sort of language that we use. So I guess we've, in our work on high streets, we've gone from something that was sort of celebratory and looking at sort of what's valuable to being more analytical, but then coming to something that's more practical guidance. And I suppose just to finish, you know, when we work on urban design and architectural projects, either with developers or public sector developers, got sort of treasury guidance or, you know, HM treasury guidance on how to establish whether it's worth investing is based on land value uplift and number of jobs almost exclusively. And there is no value placed on, say, autonomy or urban depth, you know, or any of the kind of terms that we might use to talk about those things. And so it's a real challenge to bring, you know, these sometimes quite intricate concerns to bear. And I think the aligning of language and how we use visual representation are both incredibly important to communicate and gain some kind of acceptance of these ideas in the industry and mainstream. And I guess for me, the ultimate goal is finding ways to enshrine some of these approaches in policy, and getting even sort of close to that, as we have witnessed in this sort of course of pieces of work, is a decades-long process of learning and knowledge sharing and capacity building at an institutional level. And even then, you know, when it feels like there's quite a groundswell of really quite interesting guidance documents and sort of going into policy in London, it can then still be sort of kiboshed by national policy and things like, you know, permitted development rights. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about later, and I will stop there because I'm probably running over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was great. And I note that several people on the Miro have commented on how illuminating and fascinating your sketch drawings are. I thought that was striking in connection with what you said about using drawings as a way of communicating some of these ideas more broadly. Anyway, thank you ever so much. I'd now like to move on to our third speaker. This is Nicola Bacon, who amongst other things is a founding director of Social Life. Nicola, I wonder if you could share your screen with us and then we'll begin on your talk. Is Nicola here?
Yes, I am.
There we are. Sorry, I couldn't see you in the list there.
Sorry, I'm having a screen sharing problem. It says host disabled screen sharing.
I've just made you co-host. Sorry about that, Nicola.
Sorry,
I think it's because you rejoined.
Yeah. That's what happened. Okay. Oh, sorry, nightmare. Oh God Almighty. Okay. Should I talk while I sort out my technical issues, which are really annoying, which are to do with trying to do this on 2 computers, and it's all gone a little bit wrong.
If you need to, Nicola, you can send your slides.
Hannah has them.
Yeah, I'll just
save me.
1 second.
I love this drawing on your wall that's just behind you. Just on your right. It looks very, it looks depthy.
Yes, I'm not sure about that, but yeah. Various children over the years.
Oh, is it? Oh, it looks like a picture of a street.
Ah, hang on. There, lovely. Okay, Hannah, thank you.
That's all right.
Did everyone see that? So, apologies for that, everyone. So my name is Nicola Bacon. I am going to talk about the work I've been doing at Social Life that I think follows on really nicely from Fiona's presentation, because it's very much this sort of notion of how do we understand value and how do you get some sort of alignment between different ways of thinking about cities and people and language is really important to us. So Hannah, next slide, please. Yeah, so Social Life is quite a small, very practical research agency. So we do a number of research projects and sort of very practical community-based pieces of work. And all our work really is sort of focuses on this sort of relationship between perceptions of place, how people experience places in everyday life, and the built environment and the sort of tangible realities we live with. So we say in our strapline, all our work is about the relationship between people and places. And what this diagram does is it's the way we think about social sustainability, and it's something we use to sort of organize our thinking quite a lot. And it's very much about how we bring together in understanding a place all these concepts of voice, influence, and social infrastructure, and flexibility in space to grow, and social and cultural life. And within this, the concept of well-being is really important to us. So next slide, Hannah. So well-being and resilience. So well-being is, an enormous amount of academic work has happened on concepts of well-being, and there are various different ways of thinking about it. The aspect that I'm going to talk about now really is about subjective well-being, like how we feel about our lives, how we feel about the quality of our life, how we feel about the world is treating us. And this definition, which comes from the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, is quite useful. It talks about personal well-being being a particularly important dimension, which we define as how satisfied we are with our lives, our sense that what we do in life is worthwhile, our day-to-day emotional experience, and our wider mental well-being. So there's this notion of how we're faring, and this sort of notion of, are we thriving in life or are we struggling? And there is a distinction between well-being and mental ill health, or low well-being and mental ill health. And you can well-being is something much more fundamental about just this general sense of quality of life. And resilience, the other concept that we think about quite a lot, is very much sort of part of well-being. It's like the future folk aspect of well-being, and it's about our ability to bounce back, to kind of take the knocks, to move on and thrive in the face of adversity. Those sort of notions I'm going to talk about. And when I was thinking about this and sort of notions of city depth, what really came into my head was this notion that cities are very well quantified. Like, we have huge amounts of data about cities, but far less attention is paid to perceptions and these issues about quality of life than it is to all the tangible factors about transport, about health, about crime, about infrastructure, about the environment. All these things that we can touch are very much easier to get a grasp of than well-being and belonging and these more sort of ephemeral concepts. But by thinking about well-being and thinking about cities and how they're supporting well-being or failing to support well-being, it can take us to quite a different place in terms of understanding what's helping people get by and helping people do well and what's actually causing people problems. And so the things that really affect well-being are, multiple and diverse, and the environment and built structures are very important. But a lot of social factors, and particularly relationships between people, are really, really important in this. So what I want to talk about is just 2 projects we've done that use the concept of well-being in different ways. So Hannah, can I have the next slide? So the first project is about some work we're doing at the moment for Southwark Council. And it's a piece of work that's really trying to understand how people feel about 6 particular parts of the borough, how they're experiencing change and how they're experiencing the pandemic. And we're doing this really by looking at stories and looking at a lot of qualitative material to try and get under the skin of these areas. So Hannah, next slide. So these are the 6 areas we're looking at. The Old Kent Road, again, features quite strongly in this, but it's 6 areas from Walworth in the north going down to the social housing estate to Dulwich in the south. And we're doing the research over 3 rounds. We did 1 round last summer. We've just finished a round, which was very, very difficult to do during lockdown, and we'll do another one when the restrictions go a bit more. And the way we tried to think about well-being was really to try and engage people in conversations about how they were experiencing their area and to talk to people quite openly about their lives, about what was going well, about what was causing them problems. So in the first phase, we did 246 street interviews, which we did last summer. A lot of mask wearing and glove wearing was involved in that, but people were happy to talk to us as long as they felt safe. And so the way we're bringing this together, Hannah, can I have the next slide, is we're trying to think very much about stories and the stories of the place and how they help us understand how people are dealing with this kind of quite difficult time at the moment and how that's changing how they feel about their everyday life and what the implication is for the future. So we're bringing these things together. We're trying to bring together all the stories in different ways to try and understand the kind of different elements of a place and how things are going. Next slide, Hannah. So the focus on well-being is really helping us to understand what is supporting residents and local communities, how they're experiencing change and how they're experiencing the pandemic. And this very big focus within this on understanding assets and supports that can help people get by and help people thrive, and to do that alongside the vulnerabilities that are more familiar to us sometimes about poverty and inequality and all the very difficult things that people focus on. And so the things that we've managed to, I think our approach and this storytelling approach has helped us understand in terms of sort of what I've just talked about as well-being assets. So the well-being assets that we've been talking, that people have talked to us a lot across these 6 areas of Southwark, are issues of belonging, this sort of sense of belonging to the area, about this sense of attachment that is, for some people it's to do with having grown up in the area, for some people it's to do with their families having lived in the area, but for other people it's been to do with moving in and finding a place that's diverse and convenient and works well. So belonging is very important across the areas, but means something very different if you're living around the Elephant Castle, to if you're living in Peckham, to if you're living in Camberwell. Social relationships come out strongly. Most people feel they have good local social relationships. Most people feel they have better social relationships with people who they think are like them than people who they think are different. And this is an area where we are seeing pandemic issues really coming out, sort of challenges to well-being, particularly quite a lot of issues coming out before Christmas about different attitudes to restrictions, different attitudes to behaviour, about older people really wanting to follow the rules at that time and feeling that 20 and 30 somethings were kind of letting them down. Everyone being very, very concerned about teenagers and sort of younger people in their early 20s. So well-being is moving, it seems, in some ways, and this sort of issues of social relationships is shifting quite a lot at the moment. The vulnerabilities that came out really strongly connected to well-being are mental ill health, and a lot of increasing concern throughout this project about the mental ill health of people surrounding our participants, so people who they see on the streets, people in their families, people who they know who are kind of really struggling at the moment. And this pervasive impact of inequality, which is a feature of London boroughs generally, but it is something that I think is being heightened by the experience of the pandemic. So the focus on wellbeing in this piece of research, I think, is taking us to a different understanding of the places, which hopefully will be really useful to the agencies we're working with. And just quickly, the second project, so next slide, Hannah, is a really quite
about 2 minutes there, Nicola.
Okay, that's fine. Very different project where we looked at data to try and explore resilience in local areas, and this is for Hounslow, which is a borough in West London. So Hannah, next slide. So we did a lot of complex modelling involving understanding society data, and what we've tried to do is sort of model predicted resilience across Hounslow. And what this shows us is to the right of the screen, that's kind of the Chiswick area, you have quite a lot of areas where you would expect to see quite positive resilience. And to the left of the screen, which is more towards Feltham and going towards the airport, there's lots of darker blue areas which are lower resilience. And these map quite closely to deprivation, but not entirely. And there's some quite interesting anomalies. And we use this, so Hannah, the next slide. We used this this was for Hounslow Council, and we used it to try and help them understand the impact of some of the interventions they were doing as a public authority on wellbeing and resilience. And what you see, these red blobs are planned new housing developments. And you can see there this big bit around Brentford. There's planned new housing developments in areas where there is quite low predicted community resilience. So there was a quite interesting issue there about the fragility of those communities and how they're going to cope in that way. And that's the sense of change. And then Hannah, next slide. We also, sorry, there's a lot here, but hopefully these slides will get shared. We also kind of looked at change over time and how notions of resilience were changing throughout London, which again shows quite a different picture to IMD and to the traditional deprivation measures. So just next slide, Hannah, so just to sort of wrap up really, when we're thinking about well-being and cities and city depth, I think the sort of questions for us, which is the question behind a lot of our work, is, so does this sort of focus on subjective experience help an understanding of city depth? Does the focus on lived experience help urbanism? Does it help planners? Does it help designers? Does it help all the different people in the built environment industry? And I think we think it does, but I think, just to echo what Fiona was saying, this is a decade-long endeavour trying to make the link between these different perspectives. What does the focus on well-being of these sort of less tangible things tell us about how we can design, plan and invest in cities to improve quality of life? Sort of open question. And what does it tell us about how we can help people living in cities deal with the pandemic and the aftershock, which is very much the preoccupation of our work, and I think everyone's work at the beginning, but how do we move on from this quite extraordinary state we're in over the next few years?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicola. And I'm sorry to you and to all of the speakers for having to squeeze us into this short time. The crucible format really does work for the discussion, but it's brutal for you lot. Let us move on to our final presenter. So this is Francesca Freud, who is a research associate at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, as well as teaching and researching at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Francesca, I can see you in my list. Would you like to share your screen?
Yes, can you see my screen now?
Absolutely. Fantastic.
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me along to be part of this workshop. I'm not an architect, I'm an anthropologist actually by training, but in my career I've really focused on local economic development. So I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, I suppose, because I'm trying to think about how depth in cities is important for how cities function economically as a whole. And this is the subject of my PhD that I'm doing at the moment at the Space Syntax Lab at Bartlett. And I'm using a kind of a methodology called space syntax, which Birgit has already mentioned. And it's very much about thinking about depth in space, but really through a kind of a form of graph analysis, which I'll explain in a moment. So I think people who are sort of working on urban economics talk a lot about agglomeration economies in cities. So how cities function as kind of agglomerations of people. And often they talk about city size and they talk about city density. So they're very interested in how people living in sort of large, dense cities makes them more productive, allows people to come together and work together. And there's a kind of a way of talking about this called sharing, learning, matching economies, which was defined by Duranton and Puja in 2003, but it very much draws on the ideas of Alfred Marshall and Jane Jacobs. And this idea that in cities, people share labour markets, but they also share supply chains, and they also share opportunities for knowledge sharing and ideas formation. And what I'm interested in is how the background street network of a city might kind of function to support those sharing, learning and matching processes. So space syntax, as I mentioned, it kind of takes cities and turns them into graphs. So this is a map showing Greater Manchester, which is the focus of my PhD. And there's a colour coding to this. So those parts of the city that are most integrated, where you might expect to have the most movement on the streets are red here, and the ones which are perhaps more peripheral are in blue. And the way that this is identified, we use a kind of a computer program called depth map. But what it does, it takes all the street segments in a city and it maps how close those street segments are to all the other segments in the city. So it's actually looking at the depth of each street segment to all the others. And rather than looking at crow's flies distances, the way that depth is defined is actually to do with the kind of number of directional changes that you'd make as you go from one part of the city to another, and also even the angles of those changes. So it's very much based on how human beings move across space and through space. So it's quite an interesting way of kind of producing maps that take a kind of psychological perspective of human movement into account. And as you can see, that this map of Greater Manchester, there are these kind of parts of the city that are potentially more accessible to all the other parts. And it's perhaps no surprise that these are the kind of town centres of the conurbation of Greater Manchester. So not only the centre of the city, Manchester here, but also these surrounding kind of town centres that have been incorporated into the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. The other thing that space syntax does is to identify those streets in the system that are likely to have more through movement. So they're the streets which people are likely to use as they go from any origin to any destination in the city. So they're kind of, as you can see here, this sort of red foreground network here of streets that really holds the whole city together in some way. Not only are these kind of streets likely to be the high streets, they're likely to be those streets that kind of have most movement, but they're also sort of bringing together the city, I think, in some respects. And I've coloured them in black here in the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, because what I'm trying to do is overlay that foreground network of streets with other sorts of economic information. So as you can see here, what I've actually done is map all of the manufacturing firms that appear in Greater Manchester using FAME, which is a controversial database, actually part of Orbis. Controversial because it claims to kind of map where firms are in a city, but quite often it's not necessarily as accurate as you'd want it to be at the very local scale. But I think it does give an idea of these kind of broad spatial distributions of economic activity. So you can see here that these kind of manufacturing firms in Greater Manchester seem to be valuing accessibility. They seem to be valuing being kind of relatively shallow to the rest of the system. They're in kind of central locations, but they're also kind of hugging these linear streets within the foreground network. And I find that interesting in itself because I think we tend to assume that manufacturing firms don't necessarily value accessibility. They're not like retailers who are looking for footfall. And this kind of translates into policy, I think, people's intuitions that manufacturing, you know, it's something that can be pushed somehow into more peripheral or separate areas of the city. So in fact, this map here shows, again, this is showing the integration in space syntax terms of Greater Manchester. So this large area of blue, of relatively peripheral urban fabric, is the Trafford Industrial Park, which in fact is one of the largest industrial parks in Europe. So you can see it's relatively segregated from the rest of the surrounding urban fabric. There are a few links sort of into that fabric. It's not knitted in very effectively, and it's somewhat larger scale compared to the rest of the urban fabric. And this kind of red area here is the centre of Manchester, which again is much more integrated. So I think we need to be thinking about how we treat manufacturing firms, particularly small firms that seem to value agglomeration and accessibility. The other thing I think is useful in space syntax in the way it thinks about depth is that it has a kind of a very strong multi-scale perspective. So with space syntax, we often look at the depth of something to something else on different radii. So you look at the local depth, but also the citywide depth, even beyond that to kind of European depth. So it's looking at all sorts of different scales of accessibility and proximity. And so, for example, this area that I've circled here is Strangeways in Greater Manchester, which is an area to the north of the city centre. And it's quite a gritty, integrated local area, but it's also between two foreground network streets, these streets that I mentioned, which are sort of connecting up the city as a whole. But they're also bringing in people from outside the city of Greater Manchester, which is quite important because it's led to the development of a wholesale cluster. So all these buildings in orange here are kind of connected with fashion, textiles, wholesale. And in fact, if you walk around the area, it's quite an amazing set of shop fronts that you find yourself amongst. So it's almost like you're walking through a retail centre with these kind of shop windows full of goods, full of fashion items, all sorts of accessories. And it's funny because you feel like you want to go in and actually purchase things, but in fact it's all for wholesale, all for traders. So it's a zone where you're sort of welcome but not welcome in a way if you're not part of this wholesale trading community.
That's 2 minutes, Francesca, if you would.
Thank you, yeah. So I've been sort of mapping out all the different uses that are in this area. So as I mentioned, you know, all sorts of wholesalers, but also some manufacturers, some fashion retailers. And what's interesting is that this is a cluster, but it's not bounded in space. There's no firm boundary, I would say. It spills out into the local neighbourhood. And what's interesting, coming back to what Birgit mentioned about the kind of these kind of boundaries and borders and edges, is that what you might think of as the kind of edge to part of this area, Cheetham Hill Road, is in fact a fairly integrating high street. And it means this whole area is pretty much embedded into a broader urban fabric. And the people who are working in this area can make use, for example, of the third spaces that are on this high street, which I've coloured in red here. So as opposed to kind of an industrial commercial business park, it's kind of separate in its commercial uses from the rest of the urban fabric, but it's still integrated into the whole. So to finish, I've also been very interested in economic network analysis, and funnily enough, they talk about depth and proximity in economic analysis, just as they would do in architecture or in spatial analysis, particularly because there's a rising interest in how certain industries are more related to each other than other industries. So certain sectors within the economy tend to share labour, they tend to share supply chains. And so when you look at a kind of the economic structure of a city, you should be aware of these sort of preferential links and proximities between industries. So my question for my PhD is whether, because industries are closest to each other in economic networks, does that mean that they seek proximity in urban networks? And I found that yes, they do. So in Greater Manchester, I've been looking, for example, at the creative sector, which tends to be found in the same neighbourhoods. So this is kind of creative performing arts, art centres, tends to be found in the same neighbourhoods as kind of the film and TV production sector, which is perhaps not surprising, but also advertising, management consulting, financial services. And I've been kind of colouring up this sort of ego network of these different related sectors to try and understand whether they're more likely to be related by the skills and knowledge that they share or their supply chains. So for example, the creative sector and management consulting seems to share common skills and knowledge capabilities, but with financial services, the relationship is more about the sharing of products. And then I've kind of been mapping that at the neighbourhood scale to try and identify sort of potential fields of opportunity and collaboration that these orange sectors here, these creative sectors might have within their surrounding urban fabric. So I apologise for rushing through a lot of things in a very quick presentation, but I hope I've shown that space syntax offers quite an interesting perspective on depth and accessibility that we could maybe, or you could maybe think about integrating into the broader discussions. And thank you for involving me in this, because I've been thinking a bit more about thresholds and boundaries for my PhD, which is very helpful. So thank you, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Francesca, and thank you again to all of our presenters. I think it's astonishing how much exciting content we've managed to fit in such a brief period of time. So we now have just a little under an hour for discussion of the four presentations that we've seen. Just a reminder about how to participate. If you want to, you can put a question into the chat in this Zoom meeting if you want to, and I'll call you. I'll sort of cluster questions so that we sort of get a logical order of things. You can also put a post-it note onto the Miro board. I see that people have been doing that. If you put your name on it, then I might well call you to ask that question. If you haven't, I might scoop some of those things together and push them at different speakers as we go on. Anyway, I hope that will be satisfactory. The first question that I want to ask comes from the Zoom chat, actually, and this is directed at Fiona from Philip over in Dublin. Philip, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hang on. Hi, Fiona. Look, the question I really was asking was, based on your experience to date and your extensive experience in the whole area, with the advent of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the change in the behaviour of the consumer behaviours, and also in terms of the market itself, what do you think is the future of effectively, what's the future of the city going to look like in terms of, on your basis, in terms of going forward? So to put that a tiny bit in context would be some of our high streets here in Dublin have been decimated for COVID and the move to online shopping. So what do you think is the future based on your experience?
Yeah, thanks. Am I on mute? No, I'm unmuted. Good. Yeah, thanks for that question. That is that's sort of much discussed, very big question, and it's difficult to answer, of course. My experience is quite London centric, and that isn't, there are differences about London's high streets because of the scale of the city, perhaps, and the way that different high streets kind of reinforce each other or have different characteristics. So there's a sort of, I think that just partly because of its morphology, London high streets as a network do potentially behave quite differently from high streets in other cities. Although, you know, Dublin, I don't know so much about Dublin, but I suppose there's a few things about the fragility of some high street businesses and the fact that, and the question about whether existing businesses will survive, because clearly, you know, a lot just don't have the kind of reserves that, you know, a few months of not having income is enough to put them under. And so then it depends a lot on the sort of circumstances around enterprise and whether there is a sort of, you know, a good environment for enterprise. And I think, but I also think there's something about property, certainly in London, that there's a sort of artificial, sort of rather desperate and deliberate attempt to maintain like property prices and rental prices and things, which will probably rebalance. And if space becomes more readily available, I think there's a lot more that kind of starts to set more of a a good environment for enterprise. I think in London there's quite a few things around geography, and some bits of the city will do quite well. Perhaps the sort of professional, where professionals have sort of been working from home and they've become a bit more, much more aware of their local area and stuff. But there's other bits of the city which I think will have been like really badly impacted. And I think that there, like, a lot of investment will have to take place to sort of, you know, support those places. But generally, I think this point about retail, which we always come back to, the idea that it could or should sort of depend on retail activity, it's quite, that in itself has made a lot of high streets quite fragile, because if the market does dip in sort of retail, there isn't sort of much else to back it up. And the point about very mixed use streets is that the activity supports itself. Like the offices support the shops, and all of the the different little mini supply chains and printers, and everything is part of this ecosystem. So then the other go on about this for ages. The other thing is physical environment, and the fact that they need to be good places to be and not hideously polluted and dominated by cars and things. So and that's a very difficult political thing to deal with, because there's the car lobby. So it's not a very clear answer to your question, but I think there's a lot of different strands at play there. I'm potentially quite optimistic, but I don't know how bad it is in Dublin either.
I think, thank you so much, Fiona. I think Philip's question is a topical and interesting one, and I'd like to ask the other speakers if they'd like to come in on that, I think. Birgit, did you want to jump in here?
Yes, just a note from the Netherlands. That's an observation we had, because there is always this discussion about retail. And now I think just via COVID, our last years so made us recognize much more that retail is really disappearing in many places in the city. And what we see in the Netherlands, that in the high streets are increasingly also places for manufacturing, small scale manufacturing and crafts. So basically the interest on a space is very much related to the urban depth. So for example, if a big branch of market disappears from having an interest on a special place, then it can be filled in with something else. And we see in the Netherlands that in the meantime, even some cities apply the strategy to actively invite manufacturing coming back to the main streets. But this is then always also a special challenge, because usually they need outdoor space, and there is outdoor space available in the central cities. Same goes for manufacturing in the central cities, sort of also needs to link to circularity, which again needs space, which very often isn't available in these places. So it requires quite a rethinking, let's say, of what we do in the depth of space. And in the Netherlands, in the redevelopment of central locations, we had in the last years a big trend towards very small in surface urban blocks, which are very high density, where you have no urban depth available to have whatsoever action potential to adjust. So I think there is also the importance, let's say, what's happening in the back of the high streets. Keeping this depth is really important for flexibility on the long term.
Thanks so much, Birgit. Nicola, actually, in your presentation, you talked a lot about exploring the effects of COVID at the moment on well-being. I mean, could you give us a sort of snappy prognosis of how you see the future?
How I see the future, I don't know. About high streets, I think, though, there's a really interesting thing about the high streets that are doing well through the pandemic, and it's like some centres in South London, so some centres near where I live are very buzzy now in a way they weren't just because people are using people are shopping locally more. They're using that sort of richness of local social infrastructure that's still open. And I think one of the things we're really appreciating is how much businesses, cafes, bars, those things really contribute to sort of our local social life, as well as being like commercial entities. And we're doing work for the GLA at the moment about, as part of the Good Growth by Design program, about local social infrastructure. And I think there's something really important about thinking about high streets as social places as well as places for consumption and shopping. And the role of retail is quite interesting in that. How things go in the future, I mean, honestly, you know, it's one of those, I go through phases of like having, you know, kind of great thoughts about the future, and phases I think at the moment just feels a bit like stuck, and, you know, will we just flip back to where things were before? Are we just going to all go back to our offices actually in 3 years' time? I don't know. Yeah. I
shouldn't have asked you to prognosticate.
No, I'm not in a kind of forward-thinking mode.
I hear you. Francesca, I don't know whether you'd like to comment on this point about the effects of COVID before we return to the main question sequence, so to speak.
I mean, just very briefly, I think there's a lot of questioning about cities now, and whether cities as agglomeration economies are going to be part of our future. I mean, particularly as we can do so much networking online, does that mean that it doesn't matter so much if we don't live in cities where you have a lot of this encounter between people in street networks? And I think what I would argue from my own research is that what you lose when you don't have cities is the kind of chance encounters, the unusual juxtapositions of different people in space and land uses in space. So I suppose I would just give a shout to the creative city that we might lose if we start living very far apart from each other in the future.
Splendid, thank you very much. Right, I'm excited but also daunted to see all of the brilliant questions that have popped up on the mirror, so I'm just trying to work out a good way of pulling some of those together. I guess, I mean, here's something which concerns kind of research methodology, perhaps, rather than the direct stuff, because I think that all four of the presentations today were very interesting in that they echoed things we've seen in previous workshops about the importance of visual representation as a tool of research, not merely as a way of presenting research, but looking at sketches and plans and graphs as a way of actually conducting your research, and also thinking about what it means for research to be conducted out with the universities. So to have organizations like Fiona's and Nicola's being involved. So there are a few questions of this sort that I might have I might sort of pick up. I think in particular, let's start with a question for Nicola. This is a question from Alexandra, I think, which is how did you measure resilience and well-being when you were conducting your research? Which were the variables that you consider to try and get a handle on that? Sorry if that wasn't clear, that's for Nicola. You're muted, Nicola, sorry.
Sorry. I'll put the link to the report in the chat, because that'll probably give you the full answer to this. The very kind of high level answer is that it's based on a factor and cluster analysis of the Understanding Society survey. So it's looking at where in that data we could find relationships between well-being and resilience, and then mapping those onto local areas. So there's not a simple answer to that, but the sort of variables that came out of that cluster and factor analysis were quite a lot of issues around relationships, around health. Yeah, I will send that to you. I think that's the best way to do it. And that's a piece of work that has been going on in one form or another for about 8 years. And it came out of a piece of work called the Wellbeing and Resilience Paradox that I did when we were part of the Young Foundation. So I will send you the links to that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Another sort of research type question, which I think I'm going to direct at Fiona, but I think also applies to Nicola perhaps, is a question from Jane, I think, which is how does this research affect your practice when you're employed as urban designers or architects? Do you find a conflict of interest between what you know to be valuable and what the market wants?
It's not just sometimes perhaps a conflict of interest that sort of puts it on sort of ethical terms almost, but yeah, we don't always necessarily agree, but there isn't always as much we can do about it as we would like. I think the point about representation and communication and increasingly evidence comes into it. So being able to draw on evidence to back up what your what your the kind of approach you're trying to advocate is really, really important. And it's the sort of factoid nature of it that is a bit frustrating. It's got to be the kind of statistic that a kind of funder that will resonate with a kind of massive investment fund or something. And I don't. It's not always that simple. That there is a statistic that will fundamentally justify a certain approach. But yeah, we are often always up against the kind of, ultimately it's a commercial decision. Ultimately, we're interested in this, we're interested in this, we're interested in this, but ultimately it's commercial. So it's about choosing a battle to some extent. But I definitely think, yeah, this point about communication and evidence, building an evidence base is, and then as I sort of mentioned in the presentation, policy, pointing to policy, and in term and relying on the sort of capacity in the local authority and the planning and regen departments as well. So I think things like the public practice program and stuff like that have actually been really valuable in that, in helping to kind of bring more sort of enforce in a way some sort of more meaningful approaches to urban projects.
Great, thank you. We might come back to questions about methodology a little bit later, but I'd like to shift back to sort of thinking about urban depth itself and its relationship to practice. And I think this is something that I'd like to ask all of the speakers, really, which is, you all talked a little bit about urban depth as it relates to what you found in your own analyses and your own research. How might it feature usefully in policy? What kind of policy that is and where? Maybe I'll ask Birgit, if you could start with that, please.
My findings, how they relate to policies, very, very practical one. If I'm allowed to actually also link to the question of Gary in the chat, how urban depth helps to mitigate effects of climate change, or let's say help accommodate measures for microclimate adaptation. And I think there the answer is very clear. We cannot make any more so small blocks, and that means we have to probably find ways of developing cities where it's not anymore only about investment, but that issues of more societal relevance, like cooling the cities, dealing with excess rainwater after storm surges, we have to be able to accommodate that everywhere in the city regularly. And when we see in very high density environments, and blocks get very much smaller and basically everything is built, there is no space to compensate that anymore. And there urban depth plays a big role. I think Matthew Carmona made a very nice point in his book Public Spaces, Urban Places, where we talk about the shrinkage of the urban block. And the shrinkage, actually, yes, it increases the permeability. I think that was also one of the comments, Ben, you made on my slides. There are trade-offs, and we have to find a balance. And that's, I think, very much something that has to land in urban policies, with smart rules and regulations, how to implement them, to keep permeability for people and for all kinds of flows, but be large enough and have urban depth on the different scales in order to also address microclimate adaptations on the block scale, but also use the urban edges for having large scale green, blue lines crossing the city, which helps again for refreshing the air, for example, things like that.
Thank you, Birgit, and thank you very much for answering Gary's question about climate change at the same time. That was masterfully done. Let me put the same question to Francesca, I think. How can we put these ideas of urban depth and maybe also space syntax for you to work in policy? What kind of policy and where and how do we do it?
Yes, so what I find interesting in Greater Manchester is that even though it has a very strong manufacturing past and it still has a lot of materials industries in the city, it kind of sees its future as being a knowledge economy city, really. So there's a lot of prioritization of the digital economy or the kind of more advanced types of manufacturing. And in a way, this is coming at a spatial cost, because I think the centre of the city is now being seen as a sort of buzzy residential space, which will support the knowledge economy because lots of people are living and working in the same part of the city. I suppose what I've uncovered in my research is that so many different sectors in Manchester value centrality. They value being proximate to each other. And what would be a real shame, I think, is some of these central commercial spaces being lost to residential, which actually means that the city no longer functions as an incubator, really. It's long functioned as an incubator to small business, and I think policymakers need to understand accessibility and depth and how important it is to so many different sectors in the economy, not just knowledge-based services.
Thank you, Francesca. Nicola, you come from a slightly different kind of organisation. Where do you see the links here with policy?
There's huge links with policy. Clearly about the link with policy is about the implication of what happens when you intervene to change a city, and what the output of what the effect is on the people who are living there and who use the city. So things which illuminate, I think, the complexity of sort of urban life and actually allow us to think about well-being and the different types of social usage and the different types of economic usage are just really, really helpful, because they mean that rather than making the sort of the commercial land use planning sort of conventional sort of approach to things, then you can think through things in a different nuance. So, for example, you could say that with the pandemic, throughout everywhere, we're seeing a lot of huge stress on livelihoods, huge stress on people's sort of social relationships, a huge stress on well-being, on mental health. And one of the things that we know can really underpin those things is when you live in a place where you feel you belong, you feel you are supported by your neighbours, you feel you have those kind of local supports. So there is a sort of pandemic implication of actually, well, maybe we should be minimising change to areas where there are those sorts of supports in place. And that's a very direct challenge to a lot of regeneration policy and to a lot of policy about change. So I think the policy implication is there very starkly. I think it's a bit sort of going back to sort of earlier question about kind of the trade-offs between pragmatic reality and what you do with the findings. It's like, navigating through these things is difficult and agencies are constrained for very good reasons. So it's a bit of a dance, but there is, I think, a very direct policy relevance.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Jane, I think you wanted to come in here, yes?
Yes, I was just noting, and it was mentioned by Francesca and not mentioned actually just now by Nicola, but it did latently appear in her presentation, and that's the fact that manufacturing is featured in everybody's presentation, either overtly or not overtly, because the Old Kent Road is a bit of a heart of manufacturing. And this, I think it was a comment really rather than a question, or bringing together or a noticing of an idea which is emerging. And that's something to do with urban depth facilitating negotiation. And manufacturing seems like a useful indicator of this happening, because manufacturing is often something that's a bit troublesome to its neighbours and requires negotiation, and similarly is easily deleted from the urban environment because it's often low value. And I wondered if the speakers could just comment on, well, really in response to what I've said, anything about that question of negotiation and urban depth and how those things interact.
Great, thank you. Fiona, could I pitch that to you to begin with?
And I think this might tangle in also with the question of policy. I guess this is also where I've come from.
No doubt.
Yeah, it's a kind of open question. Yes, manufacture, I think, does, also because it's got that, as Birgit's presentation this point about the sort of edge and not everything being a frontage, and about so, you know, there's something to do with, yeah, with sort of land value and kind of rental value as well, and if there's a sort of looseness inherent in there kind of just being space for stuff to happen, where every single square millimeter doesn't have a kind of price tag to it, and that's something that I think is sort of important for urban depth. In terms of policy, there's of course increasingly the sort of no net loss of employment space, which doesn't always protect and isn't always implemented, but has been starting to take hold. And I think that's something, you know, the work that you're familiar with and the work that Mark really did has kind of helped to kind of get that to be more readily accepted. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that those spaces aren't lost and re-provided in a way that is much more difficult to inhabit in that way. Yeah, I'd probably pass on to someone else, but I do think that it is a kind of indicator for sure.
I think that I had a sort of related, I'm going to continue going through the speakers, but I just wanted to abuse the chair slightly at this point, because this is something that had come to my mind when Nicola was talking about research in Hounslow, actually, which is this this idea that a good depth structure can facilitate negotiation and multiple uses, either at the same time or in the same place at different times, seems like a kind of fragile thing that we want to hold on to. And I was very struck, Nicola, when you pointed out that there was this kind of correlation between, what was it exactly? Correlation between communities which seem sort of fragile in a certain sense and large-scale housing developments, because I think one of the things that I've certainly taken from Jane's research on this topic is that housing development, especially in a city like London or indeed I guess Amsterdam or the centre of Manchester, where it's so lucrative, can really crowd out everything else. It can be quite sort of, it takes these complicated ecosystems and turns them into monocultures. So did you see that kind of causal relationship in what you investigated, Nicola, whereby these alternative uses, manufacturing, the things that Jane has talked about, were sort of shunted out by the dominance of housing?
That's it. I mean, like large scale housing development tends to happen, I suppose, so it can happen in very high value areas, but in you know, large scale housing developments in London, especially ones that are trying to sort of generate some social housing, tend to be in areas with low land values, sort of by definition. And if you're going to an area with low land values, you will often go to an area that is a bit messy and has some weird geographical features and may often have a fragile community there because of those things. So there's, in some ways, it's not a surprising relationship, but it's what new housing does when it's handled badly is it's very disruptive. So it brings in, so if you have an older kind of more settled community, and traditionally like low income communities may be very low income, but they're quite often quite rich in social strengths and sort of community strength. You know, there is a danger that that just gets trashed in the face of the new housing coming in. And I think, you know, I think London is getting better at handling those sort of regeneration practices more sensitively, but that does happen. And all the things about interesting messy areas, which is about manufacturing and those things that aren't quite so slick, that I think are really important to a city, and also give it space to be resilient. It gives space for adaptability. It gives space for things to change. It means things aren't pinned down quite so directly. They tend to go in the face of sort of overdevelopment and things being very kind of clear cut. And when we work with developers, one of the things we talk to them about is this notion of space to grow, and that, you know, the cities we love are cities that evolved over time, that have this kind of sense of serendipity. And that's a very difficult thing to sell to someone who is trying to develop something at scale that they will then sell on to individuals. And so I think there's quite a big thing here about how you negotiate all these different things and what the value is of the manufacturing, what the value is of the slightly messy space or the open space. And I think it is really important to make cities work and to make them work over time.
Great, thank you. Birgit, we've talked about London so far, but you've experience of other cities. Could you perhaps talk to Jane's point about depth as a mechanism for negotiation between these different functions? I think you're muted, Birgit, at the moment.
Yeah, just recognized. Thank you. I think it's a very important point to negotiate space. Especially it affords that with time you can have changes, and I think it's important to have depth in order to find new places with time. So when we see now that that different functions have more money, less money, have more power, less power, more interest, less interest, I think it's a constant renegotiation. And if you have more depth available, then we have more zones that can be claimed, or that the interest can be spread upon. And I think therefore also on the city scale, it's important that we have these different situations, because that means that we can integrate not only different functions regularly spread everywhere over the city, I don't mean everywhere, but you have all over the city quite similar access to resources, to services, to facilities. And I think that is also very much a matter of negotiation, and cities have to guarantee that or should have an interest in organizing this better. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Fiona, you've got your hand up. I can see it.
Physical hand. I couldn't work out how to. I'm not used to Zoom. I'm usually using Teams. I was just going to pick up on the point about negotiating different uses, and it's a quick point, but just to mention about how like the West End of London has like very sort of seriously resisted housing because of its impact on other stuff happening, and you know basically because residents have very different rights, and if there are kind of large housing developments there, it's got a big impact on the cultural life of the city as well. And so that's, you know, with the kind of scale and type of housing developments that happen in London now, it basically, you can't have mixes with cultural uses. It just, and even if the plan is to have it, it'll get shut down, closed down, and there are loads of examples of that, of the intention being this vibrant neighbourhood, and it's not possible in planning terms or in sort of licensing terms once there are large housing developments. So, but there are ways around it, and that's one of the things we did explore in the high streets and adaptive strategies, to do with timing and to do with the agent of change kind of policies and stuff. Yeah. Great,
thank you. Francesca, I don't know whether you have anything you'd like to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, I like very much this idea about negotiation, and in Greater Manchester, what it's had as a legacy of the kind of industrial revolution is this wonderful set of textile mill buildings, which, as Nicola was talking about, they've been rather wonderful, messy spaces that have allowed all sorts of smaller firms to come together and kind of work together in a more experimental fashion. And it's interesting at the moment because they're now rapidly being snapped up for residential use. And there's one particular mill in Greater Manchester which had housed knitwear firms, that, you know, a whole set of knitwear firms that had been doing interesting things, actually, because the knitwear firms had kind of spawned also a whole set of new e-commerce firms in Manchester. So even though they were kind of seen as part of the mundane economy, they weren't particularly interesting to policymakers. They were actually cross-fertilizing and sporting new innovation. But it wasn't actually the knitwear firms that when they were evacuated from the mill, this particular mill, nobody was very bothered. What they were bothered more about was that this mill had also been used by a group of artists. And obviously it's a shame when artists have moved on as well, but I think there's this kind of difficulty for negotiating for these kind of smaller firms in more mundane parts of the economy when they need this space just as much as other users.
Great, thank you. Now, Jane has a comment on this, but Jane, I'd also like to suggest that you might ask Francesca, your question about scale once you've made your comment, because I think that might be a good thing to bring in here.
Yes, I think they're probably related. Let me just find what, oh no, if I read my question, I'll probably knock out of my head what my comment was. It was on the topic, Francesca, by the way, I want to just say all of the speakers' presentations were fabulous, and Francesca, I really enjoyed yours. Your PhD sounds fascinating. I was just mulling on the topic of buildings are in some cases extremely adaptable and flexible. Those mills that you're describing are an example of that. They can be a myriad of artist studios, or they can be loft apartments, or they can be office space. I mean, they can really be almost anything. And by contrast, certain sorts of development, for example, housing development, often doesn't have that level of flexibility because in spatial terms, it doesn't exist. So thinking about the city-wide organisation of different typologies and what tends to be clustered in different places also then has a really long-term impact on what sort of uses you tend to get in those places, even if there are other forces at work like market forces and policy forces and so forth. So that was my thought, that I think this, I'm not sure what the relevance is, but that's what seems to fit in somehow to this discussion. And that leads me on to what I wrote on Miro to ask you, Francesca, which was, let me just find it. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong board.
It's the red post-it note.
Yes, I made it red. It looks as though from your work that really the theoretically, these ideas of boundaries between different types of zone is something which is translatable from the scale of the building, which is what I've been looking at, up all the way to the scale of the city. And do you think the rules and patterns at urban scale are translatable back in the other direction to architectural scale?
So, gosh, there's a lot of very interesting stuff there. I think what I found really interesting looking at Greater Manchester, because I've also been looking at it, how it's developed over history, is the sort of generic properties of space. So even though economic uses change a lot, actually the space still is useful. So for example, I was showing you Strangeways, where the wholesale cluster is now. That actually used to be a centre of waterproof manufacture. All sorts of different things have happened in that particular part of the city, but that kind of set of gritty streets has been really productive and generative right through Greater Manchester's history. And I don't think people are quite aware of it in a way. It's a kind of a part of the city people don't go to very often. But still, these kind of parts of the city that do things need to be valued perhaps a bit more within urban policy, particularly when they do things commercially in this context. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm very interested in what you've been working on this kind of idea of decorum and how people's behaviour changes as they go from one particular part of a room or a building to another. And I'm not sure, I've been trying to think about whether that works also at the urban scale, whether there are kind of ways of behaving in different parts of the city and how far that changes as you move from one part of the city to the next. I think there are things that are very translatable across the kind of different scales from city down to neighbourhood to building, and then things where maybe it would work kind of differently.
I wonder if rather than, so on the scale of the city, maybe the idea of what a particular type of building or area can afford, or what are the affordances in terms of what's possible in that place, rather than decorum in the sense of what you might wear or how you might speak. So not an individual decorum, but more a sort of organizational decorum or institutional decorum, like what type of thing is possible in a particular arrangement of city, like you were just saying about the gritty streets. What is it about the gritty streets and presumably the buildings that sit in between the gritty streets, which facilitate those productive activities? And I wonder if that's more a sense in which it's translatable rather than in a sense of affordance, I guess.
I mean, I guess space syntax would say that what's in between the kind of organisation of space and the economic activities is a sort of movement economy. So it's the degree to which the spatial configuration encourages movement in certain parts of the system. But what's interesting is that economic uses make different use of those affordances of movement economy as well. So it could be that you're actually wanting the footfall of people walking around the streets, or it could actually be that the businesses within that neighbourhood are valuing interaction amongst each other. So you get the sort of commercial buzz of people exchanging ideas through the kind of presence of people. So I think, yeah, I agree. It's really interesting how streets create these kind of affordances, which we can think about in all sorts of different ways.
Fiona, you've got a finger on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about different sort of building typologies and being more or less sort of adaptable to more kind of varied uses. And I don't think I showed it, but one of the drawings of the sort of Red Bridge out of London was a very little terraced houses having been knocked together and the entire ground floor being knocked out and the whole lot being used as like car showroom, second-hand car sales. And so you've got kind of suburban houses becoming, you know, something not industrial, but, you know, kind of messy and bigger scaled. And I think that, like, on the whole, there are buildings themselves are often reasonably adaptable, regardless of typology. But there's this point about housing and the way that it prevents other stuff happening around it in sort of policy terms and land use terms, that that sort of stuff can't happen. I sort of think that's one of the bigger issues. Like, you couldn't convert bits of a block of flats into you know, opticians and you know, solicitors' offices, because you wouldn't be allowed to. Even if spatially and in terms of the kind of accessibility in urban form, it was actually okay. So that's, yeah. And sort of within that as well is ownership structures and sort of lease and freehold structures that kind of prevent adaptability.
Thanks. That actually connects with something that I was wanting to pull off the boards and pitch at both Nicola and Birgit, actually. I'll start with you, Nicola, which is just that it touches on this thing that you mentioned in your presentation about how one of the tools at your disposal perhaps is flexibility when it comes to the legal structures surrounding occupancy of these spaces or ownership of developments and so on. I wonder whether you have anything to say specifically about the sort of what happens with housing in that rather delicate mix that you were describing.
Was that a question for me or for Birgit?
That was a question for you. I have a different question that I'm picking for Birgit.
Right. It's difficult to, I mean, there's a sort of balance between some of these structural issues and the way we experience things, which is quite sensitive and really interesting. So we've experimented with perception mapping in our time, where we've gone out and given people kind of spider diagrams and told them to assess how different places make them feel. Do they make them feel safe? Do they make them feel at home? You know, just sort of different things. And it's sort of really interesting how those things fit together. And something about the rigidity of land use and ownership models is tricky. And I'm really interested in the thing that Fiona was saying about, like, why can't we why couldn't we put an optician in a block of flats, for example, and why couldn't we? And if you look at the way older cities sort of grow up, you can see that very flexible, you know, things have happenstance come to be in certain ways, and we're not doing that very well. We're not sort of allowing things to self-plan and be organic. And even though that's in some ways a sort of hideous thought, sort of like removing constraints and not having any limitations to things sounds appalling. It sounds like so much, you know, permitted development gone totally out of control, but also the other side is limiting. So I just think there's a lot of tensions in this. I don't think that's a very good answer to your question, but yeah.
Well, I mean, if the answer to the question is that there isn't an easy answer, that seems like a good
yeah,
answer.
true.
I think related to this is a question that Agostina posed to Birgit about the specific example of the blocking off of these alleys in central Amsterdam. Agostina, I wonder whether you'd like to speak up and expand on what you said to Birgit there.
Yeah, hi Birgit. Thanks for that. I've really enjoyed all the presentations. Thank you very much, everybody. I just, I think there's an issue about accessibility and privatization and publicness. And sometimes you were mentioning that the depth was disappearing, but I think it's more that it was getting privatized. And that links it a bit with what Jane was talking about 2 weeks ago in terms of the level that there's a nuance in that relationship between the private and the public space and those thresholds between them. So it's not that the depth really disappears, but it belongs to a different type of people. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on that, on what's happening in Amsterdam in terms of what happens when you have those gates open, when you have them closed. What does the government want to do in terms of opening them up again?
I think there are two aspects. So when we look really at the old part of the city, which isn't completely replaced, but then these opening and closing mechanisms are really giving actually the people, they privatize public space. And yes, let's say that is an issue because it's taken out of the public city, but we are talking about alleys that are at times between 2 and 4 meters wide. So that is not something that you can actually, let's say, the access towards the interiors of these blocks is not something that you really can use publicly in a way. And of course, we can talk about, is that good or is it bad? But it isn't always given to people that own the land, but there is also indeed a social housing part of these locations. And in this sense, it brings at least some quality to the residents because there are no playgrounds in the city center. There is no space for children. So in this sense, it is necessary in a way, and it's a way, it's possible to mitigate, let's say, the lack of social spaces where the public is 100% commercialized in the city center. And I think the relevant one, and I think that is such a good thing, that is the important thing to keep as a city. They didn't sell the land ever, it's public ownership. And the city of Amsterdam has quite a strict, if they want to change something, they take the land back. Yeah? So we see that now also with much more potent land uses like ship wharfs along the Eye in the north of Amsterdam, where the majority of land was given in a land lease. Land lease is after 100 years coming to an end, and the city is very hard saying, sorry, you have to leave, you want something different. So they take the land back if they want it. And I think in the newer development, it's really a matter of the blocks are too small. So you have blocks that are, they don't have open space inside anymore, or it's so tiny that you cannot really use it anymore. And then it's basically only movement space. If there is space at all, it's not accessible from the edges. So there is literally spatially no depth built. It's building next to building, touching building. So I think there are two different, in these extreme dense environments, two different situations. On the one hand, yes, it's privatizing public space, but not legally privatizing it. So there's always the option of taking it back, but in the new built areas, this option isn't even built in. And that is a problem, because even if we recognize later we need it, we cannot really do that. Or then, because the difference is in the old city, the paths are rather narrow, but in the new parts built, we have road streets where cars are driving, and you do not close just the public road that is then already 10 meters or more wide. And the blocks are still quite small, and there is no depth inside this circle, which is surrounded by this square, which is surrounded by public streets. So I think it's the action potential that the city keeps or does not have anymore. And it's always the question, what is too much and what is too little depth?
But I think that's crucial. Thank you so much for the answer, Birgit. I think there's something about there's a big difference between, in general, European cities and British and UK cities. London has been getting rid of so much public space, and the same is happening here in Belfast about 30 years later. I think that the issue of ownership has to do with what I was asking in terms of how private and how public is something, who can use it, who can't. Thank you.
Thank you so much, folks. We're starting to draw towards the end of the session, but I think unfortunately, as always, there are going to be some questions which are going to drop off the end. I'm sorry about that. What we'll do is we'll put those up on the Miro, and we'll make sure that people have the opportunity to go back and look at those and answer them. But there was a sort of final synoptic question that arises again from some of the methodological comments that people have made that I wanted to ask, because it takes us back to something that Jane asked about policy. And I think perhaps I want to press the question a little bit harder again, which is that I think it's completely clear from everything that all four of our presenters have talked about that there are very important policy implications for the research that you've done, for the ideas that you've got. But there's an interesting question about how you translate the intellectual recognition that there are those implications into actual effective change on the ground, how you get leverage. And I think part of that, of course, is just a question about tactics, how you find the right people to talk to, whether you put your effort into giving evidence to local authorities or writing pamphlets, whether you should be an academic or produce a research consultancy or work in an architect's firm and so on. But I also think there's something to do with communication of the ideas. And this takes us back to something we've been looking at again and again in these workshops, which is that it's not accidental that all of the presenters over the past 3 workshops have had beautiful, powerful drawings, which have conveyed something. They've conveyed ideas and they've conveyed recommendations. It makes me think a little bit about some of the stuff that Iris Murdoch wrote about ethics. Iris Murdoch was the sort of the most underrated moral philosopher of the 20th century, I think. And one of her points was that you just miss the point if you think that the key insights of ethics are about the deployment of reason, doing a sort of internal moral mathematics. Insights, she said, are sight. They're about sight, that the key ethical things are things that you see because the world presents the reasons to you, the way the moral state of affairs to you in a particular way. And I wonder whether maybe part of the, we might say, the epistemology of architectural research, if we wanted to be fancy about it, but part of what's compelling about the research that you're all doing is the way that these drawings and different kinds of visual representations, the graphs of space syntax as well, give us that kind of direct apprehension of something which otherwise it's not possible to communicate very clearly in words, and whether using that, more sort of leaning on that tool, is a way of making the connections to the public imagination and to policymakers in a way that I think Fiona was sort of hinting at in her presentation, that drawings are the key to getting people to get excited about these ideas. So let's put a question mark on the end of that and pretend that it was a question. And I'd like to invite any members of the panel that are interested just to briefly remark on that, bearing in mind that we only have 5 minutes.
I mean, shall I say something?
Go on, Nicola, yeah.
Yeah. I think, so in my team, there's a mixture of an architect, an urban designer, a sociologist, and someone with an anthropology background, and it's the issue of visualizations is really, really interesting, and how we talk about it. And so what we tend to do to try and acknowledge these different perspectives is when we do something visual, we've well learned that we need to do a word version as well, and that not everyone, I think personally, I love the visualizations. I think it's really powerful. I think it's really creative. It sets my mind off, but not everyone gets information that way. Some people just don't. Some people you show a beautiful infographic to, and it's just not the way their mind works. And I think it's really important to come at things through different ways and to sort of never get stuck in one. And I love the drawings I've seen today, the visualizations, they're fantastic, but it's like how you get the words and pictures moving together, I think is really powerful, and how you get like the qualitative and the quantitative information. And it's all those different lenses of what kind of makes the picture work for me, which is hard work, but I think that's where we are.
Thank you so much.
I think it is, from my perspective, sometimes a little bit difficult what we communicate, because I think, of course, all our drawings make a very strong point, but they also bring the danger that they prohibit in the end that things happen. Because if I put a map on the table for a whole city that explains there are qualities in these locations, the land price goes up, and then it's exactly counteracting, let's say, what I want to achieve for, let's say, the quality I want to emphasize that the edges have. It gets turned around, and everybody will start building high price housing projects along there, because they anyway want already the location along the waterfront. But maybe you draw the attention of people that might want to invest somewhere to places that might be unseen so far. So there's always this danger, of course, as well.
Thank you. Francesca, I don't know whether you have a remark on this that you want to make to round things off.
I mean, just sort of the work that I'm doing on networks, you do end up doing a lot of mapping and network analysis, and I think there's a danger in getting a bit caught up in the data and the maps. And actually, one of the things I've enjoyed the most in my PhD is talking to companies actually about what happens on the ground and their qualitative experience of being in that city and relating to other businesses. So like Nicola, I think that you need to use these kinds of tools with a lot of qualitative backup information as well.
Super, thank you. And Fiona, since this was partly prompted by one of your reflections, I don't know whether there's anything that you'd like to add at this point.
I don't feel like I need to expand on what's already been said. I agree, and I particularly think Nicola's point about the kind of roundedness of sort of different modes of representation and communication is critical.
What a superbly ironic note for us to end on. Thank you, everybody. I'm so sorry that we haven't had a chance to go through every single question that people have posed. But as I said, do bear in mind that the Miro board is there. It's open. If you have the opportunity, everybody, this includes our presenters, to go and just have a look there. What we found in previous sessions is that the conversation has continued in a really exciting and productive way after the workshop. But anyway, it remains for me to thank our 4 wonderful presenters. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we can't give you a round of applause in person, but I thought they were absolutely wonderful presentations. And indeed, thank you to everybody for participating. It's very exciting to be exploring these ideas together. We have a final workshop in the series that's coming up in a couple of weeks' time. You can find information about that on our website, and maybe Hannah, if you could put Hannah has put a link to the Eventbrite sign-up sheet into the chat as well. So thank you, everybody, and I'm going to hand over to Jane for the final word.
I think I just have one final word, which is thank you. Is that 2 words? Thank you.
And the little tradition that we've developed in these sessions at the end of this is that we ask everybody, as you say goodbye, to unmute so that we can end in a sort of pleasing cacophony of farewells and so on as we go. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye. See you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.